My name is Grace, and 11 years ago, I sat at a folding table in a spare bedroom that smelled like fresh paint and old carpet. And I wrote the document that built everything, and I want to tell you about that room before I tell you about the boardroom, because you cannot understand what happened in the boardroom without understanding what happened in that room and what that room cost me and what I chose to do with the cost. The spare bedroom was 8 feet by 10 feet, and it had one window that faced the wall of the building next door. So the light that came through it was the second-hand kind, the kind that has already been somewhere else and arrived at your window tired and reduced. We had moved into the apartment 4 months earlier. Daniel and I, with the specific optimism of two people who have decided that a thing is possible and have not yet encountered the full weight of what possible actually requires. The folding table was mine. I had bought it from a second-hand shop 2 streets over and carried it up 4 flights of stairs myself. Because Daniel had a call that afternoon that he said he could not move, and the call turned out to be with a college friend about something that had nothing to do with the business. But by the time I knew that the table was already upstairs and assembled and positioned under the second-hand window, and I had already decided that this was where the work would happen. So this was where I sat, and this was where I began. The business plan took me 19 days to write. Not because I did not know what I wanted to say, but because I wanted to say it in a way that could not be argued with. I had spent 6 years in financial consulting before the spare bedroom, and those 6 years had given me a specific understanding of what investors look at and what makes them stop reading, and what makes them read the next page and the page after that. And I used everything those 6 years had taught me, and I built a document that was precise and specific and structured in a way that anticipated every question a serious investor would ask and answered it before it was asked. Daniel read it on a Thursday evening, and he said, "This is really good, Grace," and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "You have a talent for this kind of thing." And I noted the phrase, "this kind of thing," because this kind of thing was a 47-page financial model with a 5-year projection built on 3 different market penetration scenarios with sensitivity analysis for each one, and comparable company valuations, and a risk register, and a go-to-market strategy that I had spent 9 days researching and 4 days writing. And this kind of thing was the document that would determine whether anyone gave us the money to start. And I filed the phrase in the part of my mind that files things quietly and does not immediately decide what to do with them. The financial modeling was the part that took the longest and that I was most precise about because I understood that the model was the argument and the argument had to be airtight. I worked on it between 7 in the evening and 1 in the morning most nights because I was still consulting during the day to keep us financially stable while the business was being built. Daniel was working on the product concept during this period, which was the right division of effort. Because Daniel understood the technical architecture of what we were building in a way that I did not. And I understood the financial and operational architecture in a way that he did not. And together, in that spare bedroom, we were building something that neither of us could have built alone. And I believe that then I believed it completely, and without reservation. The first client came through a contact I had maintained from my consulting years. A woman named Patricia, who ran a mid-sized logistics firm and who had trusted my financial analysis for 3 years, and who called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "Grace, I have a problem that I think your new firm can solve." And I said, "Tell me about it." And she told me, and I spent the evening designing a solution. And the following morning, I presented it to her on a call that I ran entirely myself. And at the end of the call, Patricia said we would like to proceed, and I wrote down the contract value on a piece of paper, and I walked into the living room where Daniel was working, and I showed him the paper, and he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he said, "Grace, this is real." And I said, "Yes, it is." And he hugged me, and that moment was real. And I am not going to tell you otherwise, because the truth of what happened later does not erase the truth of what happened. Then, the investor meeting was arranged for a Thursday morning in March. And it was with a man named Richard Calloway, who managed a fund that had backed 3 technology firms in the previous 2 years, and who had agreed to the meeting after reading the business plan, which I had sent from my personal email address because we did not yet have a company domain. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully and prepared the presentation materials, which were built from the financial model. And I drove with Daniel to the offices where the meeting was held, and we sat in the reception. And Daniel straightened his jacket, and I reviewed the first 3 slides in my head the way I always reviewed things in my head before a room. And then we were called in, and we sat across from Richard Calloway and his associate. And Daniel opened the meeting, and I waited for the introduction. The way you wait for something when you know it is coming, but have not yet decided what you will do when it arrives. And Daniel said, "We are building something that we believe addresses a significant gap in the market." And he said, "I have been developing the concept for 2 years." And he said, "My wife Grace helps out sometimes with the financial side of things." And Richard Calloway looked at me and nodded and looked back at Daniel. And I sat across the table from the man I had written 19 days of work for. And I did not correct the introduction, and I did not show anything on my face that indicated the introduction required correction. And I answered the 3 financial questions Richard asked with the precision of someone who built the model that the questions were about. And at the end of the meeting, Richard said, "This is impressive work." And he looked at Daniel when he said it, and Daniel said, "Thank you." And I drove home, and I went to the spare bedroom, and I sat at the folding table under the secondhand window. And I opened my laptop, and I sent Richard Calloway a follow-up email from my personal address, thanking him for his time and attaching the supplementary financial analysis he had requested. And I saved his reply in a folder I had created 3 weeks earlier, and that I would continue to add to for the next 11 years. And I went back to work. I want to tell you what 11 years looks like from the inside of a company you built but do not own on paper. Because from the outside, it looks like growth. And from the outside, it looks like success. And from the outside, the story of Calloway-backed Meridian Solutions is the story of a founder who had a vision and executed it, and built something worth $40 million in annual revenue in just over a decade. And that story is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in the way that a photograph of a building is incomplete, because it shows you the facade and the windows and the entrance without showing you the foundation and the load-bearing walls and the specific architecture underneath that determines whether the whole thing stands or falls. The foundation was me. The load-bearing walls were me. And the architecture underneath was 11 years of financial models and client relationships and operational systems built by a woman who was introduced at industry events as Daniel's wife, and who had learned by the end of the first year to keep her face completely still when the introduction happened, because the alternative was an expression that would require explanation. An explanation would require a conversation. And the conversation would produce one of 2 outcomes, neither of which was useful. So I kept my face still, and I shook hands, and I answered questions about the business with the precision of someone who knew every number behind every answer. And I drove home, and I opened my laptop, and I worked the quarterly updates to Richard Calloway. Began in the 2nd year. Richard had invested at the end of that first meeting, and his fund had put in the capital that allowed us to move out of the spare bedroom and into a proper office and hire the first 3 members of staff. And Richard had sent a follow-up email after the investment asking for quarterly financial updates, and Daniel had said he would handle the investor communications, and then had sent Richard one email in the following 6 months that contained 4 paragraphs of general progress narrative and no financial data. And Richard had replied to that email with a question about the revenue projection variance from the original model. And Daniel had not known how to answer it because Daniel had not built the model. And so I answered it from my personal email, the way I had sent the original follow-up, and Richard had replied to my email, and from that point, the quarterly updates came from me and went to Richard from my personal address, and Richard replied to my address, and over 11 years, Richard Calloway and I built a professional correspondence that Daniel was not part of and that I saved in the folder I had created in the first week, and that grew over 11 years into a record of who understood the financial architecture of Meridian Solutions and who had been keeping the investor informed about it. I managed the operations from the second year onward when it became clear that the company needed someone to run the internal systems that Daniel was not interested in running. Because Daniel was interested in the external-facing parts of the business. The pitches, the press, the industry events, and the awards. The awards began in the 4th year when Meridian Solutions won a Regional Technology Innovation Prize, and Daniel accepted it at a dinner that I had organized and at which I sat at the table nearest the back of the room because the table assignments had been handled by Daniel's assistant who knew Daniel's. Priorities and Daniel's priorities at industry events did not include his wife in a prominent seat. Daniel gave a speech at that dinner that lasted 6 minutes and that I know lasted 6 minutes because I timed it the way I had timed Marcus's wedding speech. Except that this speech was about a company I had co-built, and the 6 minutes contained the word I 41 times, and the word we 9 times, and my name 0 times. I drove home from that dinner, and I went to the spare bedroom which we still used as a home office when we were working late. And I sat at the folding table which was still there because I had never replaced it, and I updated the quarterly report for Richard, and I sent it from my personal email, and I went to bed. The operational systems I built in years 3 through 6 were the reason the company scaled the way it did. I want to be specific about this, because specific is the only way to say it accurately. I designed the client onboarding process that reduced the average implementation time by 38%. I restructured the financial reporting framework that gave the board the visibility they needed to make the acquisition decisions that doubled revenue in year 7. I identified the partnership opportunity with a Southeast Asian distribution firm that opened the market segment that took Meridian from $22 million to $38 million in annual revenue. In 18 months, I did all of this from an office that did not have my name on the door and in board meetings where Daniel presented the strategic recommendations I had prepared the night before as his own, thinking the board meetings were where it was most precise. The erasure. I mean, Daniel would sit at the head of the table and he would present a financial analysis and the board would ask questions and Daniel would answer the questions he could answer and for the questions he could not answer. He would say, "Let me get Grace to walk you through the detail," and I would walk them through the detail, and then the board would thank Daniel for the clarity and move to the next item, and I would return to my seat, which was not at the head of the table, and I would make the notes that became the action items that I then executed, and the cycle would continue, and the company would grow, and Daniel would accept the credit with the ease of someone who has never had to consider whether the credit belongs to him. By the 9th year, the marriage had become a professional arrangement that neither of us acknowledged as such. We lived in the same house and attended the same events and maintained the appearance of a partnership for the social and professional context that required it. But the spare bedroom conversations had stopped, and the late night work sessions had separated into two different rooms. And Daniel had begun referring to me in internal meetings as our head of operations, which was not a title I had been given formally, but which Daniel had begun using because head of operations was a more manageable category than co-founder, and a more manageable category than the woman who built the financial architecture this company runs on. It was in the 10th year at the company's anniversary celebration that I heard Daniel say to a journalist from an industry publication that he had built Meridian from nothing in a spare bedroom with a vision and a laptop. And I was standing 7 feet away holding a glass of water. And I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me, and something passed between us in that look that was the clearest communication we had managed in 3 years. And what it communicated was that he knew, and I knew, and we both knew that the other knew, and that he was going to continue anyway. And I looked away, first, not from defeat, but because I had already decided what I was going to do. And I did not need the look to last any longer than the decision required. I went home that night, and I opened the folder with 11 years of emails, and I called my lawyer in the morning. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and Daniel came home at 6:43, which I know because I had been preparing the quarterly update for Richard, and I had noted the time when I heard the door. Because noting the time of things had become a habit I developed in the spare bedroom in the first year, and had never lost. And Daniel came into the kitchen, and he put his bag on the counter, and he said, "Grace, I want a divorce." And he said it the way he said most things, which is to say with the confidence of someone who has pre-decided the conversation and is now simply informing the other party of its contents. And I looked at him and I said, "Okay." And he looked at me with the expression of someone who had prepared for a different response, and then he said, "I have had the paperwork drawn up already." And he took an envelope from his bag and he placed it on the counter between us. And I looked at the envelope and I looked at him and I said, "Thank you." And I picked up the envelope and I went to the spare bedroom and I closed the door and I sat down at the folding table under the second-hand window and I opened the envelope and I read what Daniel had decided I was worth 11 years of building something that $40 million a year moved through. And Daniel had decided in consultation with his lawyer that I was worth a settlement figure that assumed I had been a supportive spouse who had contributed to the household while he built the business. The figure was not small in the way that small amounts are small, but it was catastrophically small in the way that amounts are small when measured against the thing they are supposed to represent, which was 11 years of financial models and client relationships and operational systems and quarterly updates and board meeting preparation and the Southeast Asian Partnership that had added $16 million to annual revenue and the client onboarding redesign and the 47-page business plan, written in 19 days on a folding table in a room that smelled like fresh paint and old carpet. The letter from Daniel's lawyer was 3 pages, and it contained a section that I read 3 times. Not because it was unclear, but because clarity sometimes requires repetition before it can be fully received. The section said that as Grace had not been listed as a founder or equity holder in the company's founding documentation and had not held a formal executive title during the company's operational history, her contribution to Meridian Solutions was characterized as spousal support rather than professional co-founding, and therefore the company's valuation and revenue were not relevant to the settlement calculation. I sat with that section for a long time. The folding table was cold under my hands. It was October, and the spare bedroom held the cold, the way small rooms hold things, which is completely and without apology. I thought about the word spousal, and I thought about the word support. And I thought about how those two words placed next to each other were being used to describe the woman who had written the document that brought Richard Calloway into the room and kept him there for 11 years. Through quarterly updates sent from a personal email address, because the person whose name was on the founding documents had not been able to answer a question about revenue projection variance. I put the letter down. I reached under the table where I had kept the same laptop for 7 years. The one with the hinge that needed a specific angle and the battery that required the cable. And I opened it, and I waited for it to load. The way you wait for something old and reliable and completely yours, and when the screen came up, I opened the folder. The folder had a name that I had given it in the first week of the company and had never changed. The name was Record, and inside Record was 11 years of professional correspondence, organized by quarter and by year and by recipient. And the recipient who had the most entries in the folder was Richard Calloway. I scrolled through the quarterly updates and I looked at the dates. The first one from year 2 sent on a Tuesday evening from my personal address. After Daniel's 4-paragraph email had failed to answer Richard's question about the revenue projection variance, and Richard's reply, which came the following morning, and which said, "Grace, this is exactly what I needed. Thank you," and the updates after that one. Each one building on the last. Each one demonstrating a level of financial understanding and strategic awareness that was not the understanding of a supportive spouse who helped out sometimes with the financial side of things. It was the understanding of the person who built the financial side of things and had been maintaining the investor relationship that underpinned the company's credibility for 11 years from a personal email address, because the person whose name was on the founding documents had sent one inadequate email in 6 months and then handed the relationship to his wife without acknowledging that he had done so. I looked at the folder for a long time, and then I looked at the business plan document that was also in the folder. The original 47-page document with the metadata intact. The metadata that showed the document had been created on my personal account and edited across 19 days by a single author, and that the author was not Daniel. I looked at the financial models, the original ones and the updated versions across 11 years, each one created on this laptop, on this account, with the timestamps and the version histories that showed the progression of the thinking and the decisions that had driven the company's growth. And I thought about Daniel's lawyer's letter and the word spousal and the word support. And I thought about the metadata and the 11 years of emails and the specific phrase, "My wife, who helps out sometimes with the financial side of things," said to Richard Calloway in a boardroom in March 11 years ago. And I thought about Richard Calloway's face when he heard that phrase, and the way he had looked at me when he asked the financial questions, and the way he had replied to my personal email the following morning. And I closed the laptop, and I sat in the spare bedroom for a while longer, and I listened to the sounds of the apartment, which were the sounds of Daniel moving through the rooms that the money I had helped build had paid for. And then I picked up my phone, and I searched for a name I had looked up 3 months earlier when the 10th year anniversary dinner had produced the look between Daniel and me that confirmed what I had already understood, and the name was the name of the most respected and most feared divorce and business attorney in the city, a woman named Catherine Morse, who had a reputation for taking cases that looked unwinnable and winning them by finding the evidence that the other side had decided did not exist or did not matter. I called the number and it rang twice. And a professional voice answered, and I said, "My name is Grace," and I said, "I need to speak with Catherine Morse," and I said, "I have 11 years of documentation," and I said, "I believe I am a co-founder of a $40 million company," and I said, "My name is not on the founding documents," and I said, "I would like to discuss what that means." And the voice asked me to hold, and I held, and I looked at the folding table, and the second-hand window, and the room that smelled like it always smelled. And I waited for Catherine Morse to pick up the phone and begin the part of this story that Daniel had decided was not coming. Catherine Morse's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district, and it had the kind of windows that made the city look like something you were positioned above rather than inside. And I sat across from her on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the Tuesday evening in October. And I placed the laptop on the table between us. And I opened the folder named Record, and I said, I would like to show you something. And Catherine Morse, who had the specific quality of someone who has heard many things and has learned to listen to all of them without showing what she thinks, until she has finished listening, looked at the screen and said, go ahead. And I walked her through it. In the order I had organized it, which was chronological, because chronological was the most honest way to present 11 years. And honesty was the architecture I had always built. And Catherine listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because interruption breaks the sequence. And the sequence was the argument I started with the business plan. The 47-page document with the metadata showing the creation date and the author account and the 19 days of editing history. And Catherine leaned forward slightly when I opened the metadata panel, and she looked at the author field, and she looked at the creation date, and she looked at me, and she said, this was created entirely on your account. And I said, yes. And she said, and Daniel's name is not in the editing history. And I said, no. And she said, not once. And I said, not once. And she made a note, and I moved to the financial models, the original ones from year 1 and the progression through 11 years. Each version created on my account, each one time-stamped, and each one showing the analytical thinking that had driven the company's strategic decisions. And Catherine went through 3 of them with the focused attention of someone who understands financial documents and who is reading them not for the content, but for what the authorship of the content proves. And after the 3rd model, she sat back and she said, Grace, how much of the company's financial strategy came from these models? And I said all of it. And she said all of it. And I said every projection, every sensitivity, analysis, every acquisition recommendation, every partnership evaluation. All of it came from models built on this laptop on this account. And Catherine made another note. And then I opened the Richard Calloway correspondence, and I showed her the first email, the one I sent the morning after the investor meeting when Daniel had introduced me as the wife who helps out sometimes with the financial side of things. And I showed her Richard's reply, and then I showed her the next 11 years of quarterly updates sent from my personal address, and Richard's replies to my personal address. And Catherine read through the emails in silence for longer than she had spent on anything else. And when she looked up, she said, He has been corresponding with you directly for 11 years. And I said, yes. And she said, not. With Daniel, and I said Daniel sent 1 email in the first 6 months that did not answer the question. Richard asked, and after that, Richard communicated with me, and Catherine said, and all of this is from your personal email account. And I said, yes. And she said, so there is a clear record showing that the primary investor relationship was maintained by you independently for the entire duration of the company. And I said, yes. And Catherine Morse, who had a reputation for taking cases that looked unwinnable and finding the evidence that the other side had decided did not exist, looked at the folder on the screen and looked at me and said, Grace, this is not a difficult case. And she said the other side has made a significant error. And the error is that they looked at the founding documents and they saw your name was absent. And they concluded that the absence of your name meant the absence of your contribution. And she said, What they did not do was ask where the contribution actually lived. And she said it lived here. And she pointed at the laptop and she said 11 years of it, and she said we are going to be fine. And I drove home from that meeting with the specific feeling of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just found out that the weight was always going to be worth it. The counter notice arrived at Meridian Solutions on a Monday morning. And I know the details of its arrival because Daniel's assistant called him out of a staff meeting to receive it. And Daniel took the envelope and opened it in the corridor outside the meeting room with 3 members of his senior team present. And I know this because one of those senior team members was a woman named Jo, who had worked at Meridian for 6 years and who had always known whose thinking was behind the financial strategy, because Jo had been in enough board meetings to understand the difference between the person presenting and the person who built what was being presented. And Jo sent me a message that evening that said, simply the look on his face, Grace, and I read the message and I put my phone down and I went back to the quarterly update I was finishing for Richard, because the quarterly updates did not stop during this period, because my professional relationship with Richard Calloway was not contingent on my personal situation, and because the updates were the record and the record continued. Daniel called at 7:14 that evening and I answered, because I had decided I would answer his calls during this period for the same reason I had always kept my face still at the industry events, which is that composure is not the absence of strength. It is the most precise expression of it. He said, "What is this?" And his voice had the quality of someone who is performing calm over something that is not calm. And I said, "It is a legal response to your settlement proposal." And he said, "Catherine Morse?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Grace, this is not necessary." And I said, "I disagree." And he said, "We can resolve this without making it complicated." And I said, "Daniel, I would like you to speak with Catherine Morse directly." And I said her contact details are on the notice. And he said, "I am not going to negotiate with a lawyer over something we can discuss ourselves." And I said, "Then I look forward to seeing you at the meeting." And he said, "What meeting?" And I said, "You will receive the invitation tomorrow morning." And I said, "Good night, Daniel." And I ended the call and I sat in the spare bedroom at the folding table and I opened my email and I sent 4 invitations to a meeting scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. The first invitation went to Catherine Morse. The second went to Daniel's lawyer. The third went to Daniel, and the fourth went to Richard Calloway, and the subject line of the 4th invitation was different from the others, because the 4th invitation contained 3 additional sentences. The first sentence said, "Richard, I am writing to you in the capacity in which I have always written to you, which is as the person responsible for the financial architecture and investor relations of Meridian Solutions." The second sentence said, "I am requesting your presence at a meeting that I believe will require your direct knowledge of the professional relationship we have maintained for 11 years. The third sentence said, "I think it is time for the room to understand who has been keeping you informed." And Richard Calloway replied in 4 minutes, and his reply contained 2 words, and those 2 words were, "I will be there." The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and I arrived at Catherine Morse's offices at 9:15 because arriving first was not a strategy. It was simply who I was and who I had always been. The person who arrives before the room is ready and prepares the room for everyone else, except that on this Thursday morning, preparing the room meant something different from what it had meant for 11 years. It meant setting up the presentation cable and confirming that the boardroom screen connected to my laptop correctly, and checking that the folder named record was organized in the sequence I had decided on, which was the same chronological sequence I had shown Catherine 3 weeks earlier. Because chronological was still the most honest way to present 11 years. and honesty was still the architecture I had always built in the laptop, was the 7-year-old one with the hinge at its specific angle and the cable running to the wall. And I had considered bringing a newer machine for this meeting and had decided against it because the 7-year-old laptop was the machine the evidence lived on, and the machine the evidence lived on was the machine that should be in the room. Catherine came in at 9:30, and she looked at the setup, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Daniel's lawyer called this morning, and she said he is expecting to negotiate a revised figure." And I said, "I know." And Catherine said, "He does not know what is in this room," and I said, "No, he does not." And Catherine said, "Good." And she poured 2 glasses of water, and we waited. Daniel arrived at 9:58 with his lawyer, a man named Stephen, who had the specific confidence of someone who has won enough rooms to have stopped considering the possibility of losing one. And they came in, and Stephen put his briefcase on the table, and Daniel looked at me, and then looked at the laptop connected to the screen, and then looked at Catherine, and he said, "Good morning." And Catherine said, "Good morning," and indicated the seats on the opposite side of the table, and Daniel sat down and looked at me again, with the expression he had worn on the Tuesday evening in October, which was the expression of someone who has pre-decided the conversation and is waiting for the other party to accept the terms. And then the door opened, and Richard Calloway walked in. And the room changed, the way rooms change when someone enters who has a specific gravity that rearranges the atmosphere around them. Richard was 61 years old, and he had been investing in technology companies for 25 years. And he had the specific quality of someone who has seen enough to know immediately and completely what he is looking at and what he is not looking at. And he walked into the room, and he looked at me, and he said, "Grace." And he said it the way he had always said it in the 11 years of correspondence, which was with the direct and uncomplicated respect of a professional who knows who he is talking to. And he crossed the room, and he shook my hand, and he said, "It is good to see you." And then he looked at Daniel, and he nodded, and he said, "Daniel," and he sat down in the chair Catherine had placed at the end of the table, equidistant between both sides, because Richard was not here as a partisan. He was here as a witness, and witnesses sit where they can see everything. Daniel looked at Richard and then looked at Stephen, and something moved across his face that was not quite the expression he had arrived with. And Stephen put his hand on the table in the specific way that lawyers put their hands on tables when they are about to establish the parameters of a conversation. And he said, "We are here to discuss a revised settlement framework that our client believes more accurately reflects the contributions of both parties." And Catherine said, "We are here to present evidence that establishes the professional and legal standing of my client as co-founder of Meridian Solutions." And Stephen said, "Your client is not listed as a founder in any of the company's founding documentation." And Catherine said, "That is correct." And she looked at me, and I leaned forward, and I pressed the key that put the laptop screen onto the boardroom display. And the first thing that appeared on the screen was the business plan. The 47-page document, and the metadata panel opened beside it, showing the creation date and the author account, and the 19 days of editing history and the author field, which contained my name and not Daniel's. And the room looked at the screen, and Stephen looked at it, and Daniel looked at it, and Richard looked at it with the expression of someone seeing something confirmed rather than something new. And I said, "This is the founding business plan for Meridian Solutions." And I said it was created on my personal account over 19 days in the first year. And I said the metadata shows a single author. And I said that author is me. And I moved to the next slide, which was the original financial model, and then the year 2 model, and then the year 5 model, and then the year 9 model. And I showed the progression, and I showed the authorship on each one. And the room was quiet. in the way that rooms are quiet when they are receiving information that is rearranging what they believed they understood. And then I opened the Richard Calloway correspondence, and I put the first email on the screen, the one from year 2, sent from my personal address after Daniel's 4-paragraph email had not answered the question about revenue projection variance. And I showed Richard's reply, and then I moved through the quarterly updates. 11 years of them, each one from my personal address, each one demonstrating the financial and strategic understanding of someone who was not helping out, sometimes with the financial side of things. And Stephen looked at the emails and looked at Daniel, and Daniel was looking at the screen with the expression of someone who is watching something they cannot stop. And Richard Calloway cleared his throat, and he said, "I would like to say something." And Catherine said, "Please." And Richard turned to face the room, and he said, "I have been an investor in Meridian Solutions for 11 years. And he said in that time, I have received 2 categories of communication from the company. And he said the first category was occasional narrative updates from Daniel that contained general information about the business. And he said the second category was detailed quarterly financial reports from Grace that contained the analytical depth and strategic clarity that justified my continued investment. And he said, I want to be direct about something. And he said there were periods in the company's history where Daniel's operational decisions concerned me significantly. And he said there were 2 specific quarters in year 6 and year 8 where I considered withdrawing my investment because of what I was observing in the market. And he said the reason I did not withdraw in either of those quarters was because Grace's quarterly updates gave me confidence that the financial architecture of the company was sound, even when the leadership decisions were not. And he said I kept $40 million in Meridian Solutions because of the woman sitting on that side of the table. And he said, I think it is important for this room to understand that clearly. And the room was quiet for a long time after Richard finished, and Stephen put his pen down and picked it up again. And Daniel looked at the table in front of him, and I looked at Daniel, and I said, I would like to state my position. And I said, I am the author of the founding business plan of Meridian Solutions. And I said, I built every financial model the company has operated from. And I said I maintained the primary investor relationship for 11 years independently. And I said I designed the operational systems that took the company from a spare bedroom to $40 million in annual revenue. And I said my name is not on the founding documents. And I said that does not change what I built. And I said I am seeking recognition as co-founder. And I said I am seeking 50% of the company's current valuation. And I said I am also seeking a formal correction to the company's founding record to accurately reflect authorship. And I said, I think that is fair. And I said, I think everyone in this room knows it is fair. And I looked at Daniel, and Daniel was looking at the screen where 11 years of evidence was still displayed. And he did not look like the person who had placed an envelope on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday evening in October, with the confidence of someone who has pre-decided the conversation. And I waited for him to say something, and he did not say anything. And the room held the silence. And I let it hold, because the silence was doing the same work it had always done, which was telling the truth more clearly than any words that could have followed it. The signing happened on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting, and it happened in Catherine Morse's office. Because Catherine's office was where things that needed to be witnessed correctly were witnessed correctly, Daniel arrived with Stephen, and they sat on the same side of the table they had sat on during the meeting. Except that the atmosphere of that side of the table was entirely different from what it had been 2 weeks earlier. Because 2 weeks earlier, Stephen had placed his briefcase on the table with the confidence of someone who has not yet seen what is in the room. And on this Friday morning, Stephen placed his briefcase on the table with the careful precision of someone who has seen everything in the room and has spent 2 weeks adjusting his understanding of the situation to match what the room contained. Richard Calloway was present again because Richard had asked to be present. And Catherine had agreed because a witness of Richard's standing was not an addition to the proceedings. It was a clarification of their significance. And Richard sat at the end of the table in the same equidistant chair. And he looked at the documents in front of him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a correction to be made, for longer than the correction has been under discussion. The documents were 43 pages, and they had been prepared by Catherine's team over 2 weeks, and they contained the legal recognition of Grace Chen as co-founder of Meridian Solutions, with 50% equity standing retroactive to the date of the company's founding. And they contained the formal amendment to the company's founding record to accurately reflect the authorship of the business plan and the financial architecture. And they contained the settlement terms that replaced the envelope Daniel had placed on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday evening in October, with a figure that reflected what 11 years of co-founding a $40 million company actually meant Stephen had negotiated for 9 of the 14 days, and on the 10th day, Catherine had sent him the complete Richard Calloway correspondence, printed and bound in chronological order, with a note that said, "I believe your client should review this before we continue negotiating." And after that, the negotiation had taken 4 more days, and the final figure had not required further discussion. Daniel picked up the pen on the 3rd page and he signed, and he moved to the next page, and he signed, and he continued through the document in the specific silence of a man who has understood that the pen moving across the page is the most honest thing he has done in 11 years. And Stephen initialed where Stephen needed to initial, and Catherine initialed where Catherine needed to initial, and Richard witnessed where Richard needed to witness, and when the final page was signed and dated, Daniel put the pen down and he looked at the documents in front of him, and he did not look at me, and I did not require him to. I had not come to this room for a look. I had come for the signature, and the signature was on the page, and that was what the room had needed to produce, and it had produced it. And I picked up my copy of the documents, and I put them in my bag next to the 7-year-old laptop, and I thanked Catherine, and I thanked Richard. And I left the building, and I drove to the house that I had been living in during the 2 weeks since October, and I went to the spare bedroom, and I stood in it for a moment. The folding table was still there under the second-hand window, and the light coming through the window was still the second-hand kind, the kind that has already been somewhere else. And I looked at the room, and I thought about the 19 days of the business plan, and the first client call, and the investor meeting where I had kept my face completely still, and the 11 years of quarterly updates sent from a personal address at 10:30 in the evening, and the folder named Record, and the hinge that needed a specific angle. And I picked up the folding table, and I carried it to my car, and I put the laptop bag on the passenger seat, and I drove away. And those were the only things I took, because those were the only things in that house that were truly mine. Everything else had been maintained and managed and kept running by the same hands that had written the business plan. But maintaining something and owning it are different categories. And I had spent 11 years learning the difference. And I was no longer interested in maintaining things that did not belong to me. I arrived at Meridian Solutions on a Monday morning at 8:50. And I want to tell you about the door. Because the door is where this story has always been going. The glass door of Meridian Solutions had been updated on the Friday afternoon after the signing by a company that Catherine's office had arranged and that I had approved on Thursday evening, and the door now had 2 names on it and 2 titles. And the first name was Daniel's, and the first title was co-founder, and the second name was mine, and the second title was co-founder, and the lettering was the same size and the same weight and the same position, because that was what accuracy looked like. And I stood outside the door on Monday morning, and I looked at my name on the glass, and I looked at it for a long time. Not because I needed the looking to make it real, but because I had been looking at that door for 11 years from the inside, and I had never seen my name on it. And the difference between those two ways of looking at the same door was the distance between who I had been in that building and who I was now. And the distance was worth looking at for as long as it needed to be looked at. I pushed the door open and I walked in, and the office was already occupied, because the staff of Meridian Solutions arrived early and worked hard, and this had always been true, and had always been in part a consequence of the operational culture I had built. And the staff looked up when I came through the door, and Joe was the first person I saw. And Joe looked at me with the expression she had worn in every board meeting where I had walked through the detail, and the room had thanked Daniel for the clarity. And Joe said, "Good morning, Grace." And she said it the way you say something when you have been waiting to say it correctly for a long time, and I said, "Good morning." And I went to the office that now had my name on the door, and I put the 7-year-old laptop on the desk, and I opened it at its specific angle, and I began to work. And I want to say something to you before this story ends, because I think if you have stayed through all 6 parts, you were not just listening to Grace's story. I think you were sitting in the spare bedroom with her. I think you know what the secondhand light feels like, and I think you know what it means to build something real in a room that nobody considers important enough to photograph. And so I want to say this as directly as I know how to say anything. You do not need your name on the document to know what you built. But the document matters, and the name matters, and the door matters. And if the people who were supposed to see you decided instead to look through you, then the answer is not to become smaller, and the answer is not to stop building. The answer is to keep the folder open and keep the timestamps accurate, and keep sending the quarterly updates from your personal email. Because the record is the argument, and the argument is the foundation. And the foundation is what everything else stands on. And one Monday morning you will walk through a door, and your name will be on the glass. And the light coming through that door will not be secondhand, and it will not be tired, and it will not have been somewhere else. First, it will be yours. Direct and complete, falling on a desk where a 7-year-old laptop sits open at its specific angle. And the work that was always yours is finally seen as yours. And that is not the end of the story. That is the beginning of the one where you already know what you are worth. And the room knows it too. And the door says so. And you walk through it every morning, and you do not look back, and you do not need to.